man trying to find these guys one by one, and he kills them. And at first, like that first episode, when you see all that, that's wrong. How could they kill his family, to cover up this stuff? And you're like, yeah, go get him. And then I'm telling you, each episode, it got progressively more gruesome. And I wasn't rooting for him by the end. I think the producers meant for me to, but by the end, I'm like, ew, you're like gross. You know what I mean? You're evil now. You're the evil person, right? But I think I kept waiting, like Vivian said a couple weeks ago, I kept waiting for the story to turn to redemption, where he would realize, I don't need to do this to find justice or something, right? But it never did, and it ended like literally him sailing into the sunset. Well, I don't know, maybe some of you might see this, so I don't want to give any of the ending away. But anyway, I don't know, I don't recommend it.
You didn't say the name of the show.
And he kills his best friend. And I'm just like, oh, and then it's like the end, credits roll, and I was like, okay, no. But you know what? I think these kinds of movies and shows pop up in our culture in a time when we feel more helpless and vulnerable and that there's this general sense of injustice. And so, all the like dirty, hairy movies and the vigilante things came out when people felt like nobody's doing anything to protect us, right? And so I think today we have that strong sense of corruption in our society, right? But it's actually a human problem that has been around since the fall. This isn't a new thing. And so in that sense, that life is wrong and not fair is what I feel Peter's addressing here, that God's addressing through Peter to us of all ages and eras. What do you do when you feel helpless and vulnerable and that you're being treated wrongly, unfairly, you're being slandered or punished or suffering unjustly? The world would say, get revenge. Seek justice, do it in your own way, whatever it takes. What is God's way? That's what we're going to look at here. And okay, I'm going to jump to the end of the story, so to speak. If you look at the end of our passage, I'm full of spoilers tonight. We have a purpose, even in a broken world. We have a calling, is what this calls it. Verse 21, for to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. So that is God's way, and I want to kind of deconstruct it. I want to see what we can tease out of this that talks about how we handle that. Our purpose is to follow in the footsteps of Christ. Okay, so have you ever been hiking on a really challenging trail? I don't do it very often. But there's some spots that are kind of gravelly, and so if you step there, you could slip, right? Sometimes it's wet and slippery, and so you don't have any traction. There's sometimes rocky spots, or maybe too narrow, so you can't get your foot in the right spot. So, or you cross over a stream, and some are flat, some rocks are nice and flat. Some you step on them and they're not stable, so you can fall in the water. So when I hike, here's my secret. I follow Dan. And, he stepped on that rock, and I stepped there. And avoid that. Okay, I'll step over that, right? That looked stable. So I just go, I'm not kidding you. He put his right foot there. I'm putting my right foot there. He puts it, okay, I'll do it. Like a big stretch. He's got longer legs, whatever. But that is how I can navigate a really difficult trail. And so I like to have somebody more experienced when things are above my abilities like that, and just go step by step. And that's what God is asking us to do here. Christ is our hiking guide because he's walked this path before, and he knows how to navigate it. So, looking at this passage again, what is the trail that we're walking? How is it describing this trail? Or should I say trial, right? from this passage, it's clear that we're going to encounter people who speak against us and say that we're the bad guys. Let's look at verse 12. I'm jumping back a little. I know we covered 13, but I saved 12 for this week. It says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And just for reference, Gentiles is anyone who is not a Jew, and in this case, it would be not a Christian, so it would mean non-believers. Keep your conduct among non-believers honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God in the day of visitation. People are going to speak badly about you because you're a Christian. What do? This says to act honorably. And I looked that up because, we use some words often and then it kind of loses its, we assume a certain meaning. So when I looked it up, honorably is goodness. Your actions need to be characterized by goodness, being kind, true. In fact, King James calls this honest conversation. Keep your conversation honest among the Gentiles. And we can see, if we flip over to the section about Jesus' example, which is verses 22 to 25, I'm going to jump back and forth between how we're being described and what Christ did. Okay? So we're told to act honorably among Gentiles. And if we jump over to verse 22, it says, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. So in that same way, when people called Jesus a bad guy, or whatever the term is, a heretic, a lunatic, he did not do anything dishonorable toward them. He did not sin. He did not say mean things back. He didn't deceive or lie to avoid problems. He had honest conversations with people. The second thing I want to look at, so the first one is just that people are going to speak against you and call you evildoers. The second thing we see here is a lot about authorities. We're going to be under various authorities. We're always under authorities in our lifetime. It's a government or your work or within the family. We're all women, right? So if you're married, you're under the authority of your husband, and we get into that next week. But what if our authority figures are not fair? Or we don't see justice being done? Let's just quickly read through 13 to 18. It says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. A lot of honors in this section. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, which is another form of the word honor, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So here we're seeing that God has set up authorities, and the idea of being of submitting, I don't know if you looked that up as part of the homework, but it was to put things in order, right? And if you think about creation, remember at the very beginning, the earth was void, formless, right? It wasn't set up. There wasn't a creation order. There wasn't a system, for lack of a better word. And then that was the first thing that God does, is he comes in and he sets up order. And so we, in a fashion, are acting out that creation by getting into order what God has established. So even though we live in a fallen and broken world, we're still told to put ourselves in that order that God has already established way beforehand, even though it's not ideal, right? Can we jump over to Romans 13? If you open up your Bibles, Romans 13, starting in verse 1. This is mirrors a lot of what we're looking at here, but it adds a little bit to it that I think is helpful. Romans 13, starting in verse 1. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." Now that's the same. "For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Even the bad guys, even the ones we don't agree with, even the ones that are cruel, it says here, there is no authority except from God. Verse 2, "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good." And he goes on through verse 7. But the idea here is that God has established these people for good. Does it mean that they do good all the time? No, because if we jump back to that 1 Peter section, it says, not just, it talks about masters, but the principle is the same with general authorities, government authorities. You don't just submit to good and gentle rulers. It's saying also to the unjust. And oftentimes it feels that's what we have. But imagine if here in San Jose, in California, in the United States, we had no government. Okay, you think it's bad now, right? When there is nothing that's restraining people, it's worse, right? We saw that from when police were not able to do their jobs, right? So even though you may perceive our government right now as not being just, it's still better than without it. So God put it there so that we would have some sort of limitations and protections. So do good. In fact, that expression, do good and good deeds, do you know how many times that shows up? Did you notice that kept coming up? It's in verse 12, see your good deeds and glorify God. Verse 14, praise to those who do good. Verse 15, that by doing good you should put silence foolish people. And then in verse 20, when you do good and suffer. So it's really emphasizing this idea. You're going to be under authorities, and they may do good and they may not do good. But what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to be doing what is right, following Christ's example. And let's jump, speaking of Christ's example, what is it that is doing good? How is it when an authority over Christ, meaning at that time either the Roman government or if you consider the Jewish people, when he was abused and crucified, what did he do? Did he say, "You're not the boss of me," right? And that's maybe what I would want to say in that situation. Or something worse. Verse 23 says, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. So that reviled, I have it in my notes somewhere, but basically it's like insulting people, it's being crude and slandering, mocking, making fun of. That's kind of all encompassed in reviling. He didn't do that. That happened to him, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't seek his own justice. When he suffered, he didn't threaten them back. Wait till my Father comes and judges you, right? No, he didn't. What does it say? If we continue in verse 23, it says, he trusted himself to the one who judges justly. Over and over, do good, don't retaliate. Also in verse 17, we are told, honor, respect, even value everyone and show love. And of course, when someone is our enemy, it's hard to like see value in who they are. Like, oh, they're such a waste, right? A waste of space or a waste of air. That's an expression, right? But as Christians, we see value. Why? Because of God. Because God sees that, and they're creations just like we are, in God's image. And who are we to say at some point that person isn't going to become a brother or sister? We have to see value in them. And just as a sidebar here in terms of government stuff, so we live in a constitutional republic, which means our ultimate authority is the Constitution. And the arbiters of that authority are governors, presidents, judges, congressmen, all that kind of thing, right? But ultimately, they are supposed to submit to the authority of the Constitution. So we have permission by that authority, by that ruling law, to protest peacefully. So if we see injustice, we have been given permission by our government to say, hey, stop that, right? Or we think this is wrong, and that's okay. And in the same way, we saw that example in Acts with the Apostle Paul when he was arrested. Well, yeah, and he said, I want to take I'm a Roman citizen, I'm taking my case to the emperor, to Rome. And they're like, oh, okay. And that wasn't wrong. That he wasn't in sin when he did that, right? So we have avenues. I'm not saying you need to lay down and let everybody stomp on you, but a lot of it is how we deal with the things. What is our attitude? Are we honoring and respectful in that protest? Are we loving people? Are we valuing our enemies, right? I think that's more important than just laying down and taking something. It's what's our heart attitude. And that's the hardest part of all, okay? Another example is Daniel. And Daniel lived in a very hostile nation, hostile to Israelites, right? They were taken captive into Babylon. And he served directly under King Nebuchadnezzar, right? And what was it? His gentle spirit, but he was firm in his convictions on worshiping the Lord first and not worshiping kings. And also under Darius, we saw the same thing, King Darius. And yet in this good context, doing good, he was able to influence both kings. That's amazing. Because these guys were not softies. They were hardened warriors. And yet God used Daniel to soften them toward him. So we don't know what God's going to do. I just want to encourage you, don't be discouraged, because you will face injustice. You will face things that are unfair. You will be wrongly slandered and accused in the world, but that's okay, because we're walking in the steps of Christ. Just take one step at a time and see what did he do? Okay, I'll step here, I'll do this. Verses 19 and 20, I know I'm hopping around a lot. I'm kind of going back and forth. Talk about enduring. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, none endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. None? Sorry, I retyped it. I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. When one endures sorrows, thank you for suffering unjustly. I better read my original. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of the Lord. So it's natural. We should expect negative consequences when we've done something wrong. And he's saying, you better take it. Put on your big girl pants, right? It's time to take it. That's a natural thing. But when it's not your sin that you're being punished for, that's when it's called a gracious thing twice, at least in the ESV version. And so what this gracious thing is to, the other words are, it causes joy to the Lord. It pleases the Lord. It brings gratitude and favor. That's what grace is. So a gracious thing is you're pleasing God when this happens. So speaking of the ultimate injustice and suffering, we see that here with Christ too, don't we? In verse 24, it says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. So in a sense, Christ was being blamed for every single bad thing that any of us in the past and in the future have ever done. And he took the blame for that. Can you imagine? How does it feel when one person says a mean thing to you? It's like, no, that's not right. But to have, I can't even, I don't think they're countless things that he bore. And bearing isn't a light word. It means it was this heaviness on him. And he did it, it says in verse 24, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. He never sinned. It says he never deceived. He never reviled. He never threatened. He never dishonored anyone. And yet he took the punishment